The beam of the flashlight cut through the dust like a blade through silk. For a long moment, nothing moved inside the chamber. The archaeologist held the light steady, his breath shallow, his hand trembling so faintly that the beam quivered against the ancient stone. Then the dust began to swirl, caught in the pressure displacement of air that had been sealed in this space for 2,217 years. The smell hit his lungs first, baked earth layered with something older, something mineral and metallic, like the exhalation of the mountain itself. His partner stood frozen at the entrance, unable to speak. The silence inside the chamber had a weight to it, a presence, as if the room itself was waiting for the outside world to prove itself worthy of what lay within. When the beam finally settled on the first object, the men could not move. A face stared back at them. Not a skull, not a fragment, a face. Features carved with such precision that the eyes seemed to carry intention, the lips seemed to hold a command, and the jaw seemed set with the quiet authority of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. The dust swirled faster now, disturbed by the first human exhalation inside this space in over 2 millennia. The archaeologist kneeling closest felt his knees weaken. He had read the records. He had studied the legends. He had pored over the accounts of Sima, the grand historian of the Han dynasty, who wrote more than 100 years after the events and still spoke of what lay inside the tomb complex of Qin, Shi Huang with a kind of reverent terror. But nothing in 1,000 scrolls or 1,000 scholarly debates had prepared him for this face, for the sheer density of presence radiating from beneath the soil of Shanxi province. Somewhere above them, the farmers of Lintang district were still drawing water from their wells. Somewhere in the village, children were still chasing chickens across the packed earth paths. The year was 1974, and the outside world had no idea that history was about to fracture. The villagers of Lintang had stopped being startled a long time ago. Living so close to the great necropolis on the northern slope of Mount Li, they had grown up hearing stories. Old grandmothers, sitting on the low earthen stoops of courtyard homes, told tales of ghostly armies marching in mist across the hilltops. Fishermen on the nearby rivers swore they heard bronze drums echoing from beyond the reeds at dawn. Scholars in distant Beijing had long suspected that something monumental lay beneath the patchwork of wheat fields and persimmon groves, but no one had dared mount a full excavation. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who had unified all of warring China beneath a single banner, the man whose name meant August God, was considered untouchable, not because of archaeology, but because of fear. There were records. Sima wrote in the 1st century before the Common Era that the necropolis contained palaces and scenic towers for 100 officials, that the ceiling was inlaid with pearls to represent the sun, moon, and other heavenly bodies, and that within flowed rivers of mercury, mechanized to move in perpetual currents, fed by ingenious bronze pumps buried deep beneath the earth. Sima also wrote something far more disturbing, that the hundreds of craftsmen who constructed the inner chambers, along with anyone who knew the precise location of the burial entrance, were sealed inside upon completion. Nothing of its outside was visible, he wrote. They planted trees and made a hill. To the farming community of Lintang, these were not abstract lines of ancient prose. These were the bones of their own land. The hill itself, when travelers looked up at it from the surrounding plains, did not appear natural. Its curves were wrong about the base, as though something underneath was pushing up, as though the mountain itself was a disguise. When a group of well diggers in early March of 1974 struck something unusual at a depth of approximately 6 feet, they had no idea what they had awakened. They were simply looking for water in the middle of a prolonged drought. Their shovels struck not the anticipated clay, but a strange hard substance. A substance that, when brushed clean, showed the unmistakable sheen of fired ceramic and a color that matched neither the dust nor the earth but a regimented flesh tone. The fragments were not pottery, they were not tiles. They were becoming recognizable even in pieces as fragments of human forms. Hands, torsos, the unmistakable curve of a buttoned officer's vest. Word traveled quickly. State authorities were informed. A small investigative team was dispatched from the provincial archaeological office, expecting perhaps a smashed sarcophagus, perhaps an abandoned kiln site at most, a curiosity. What they found as the weeks of excavation expanded across more than 16,000 square meters would fundamentally rewrite human understanding of ancient civilization. If you believe that buried civilizations deserve to be heard, please subscribe and join our investigators. The case, then, is not merely archaeological. It is the case of history itself, a crime scene where the names of the dead have been altered, where their deeds have been reduced to mockery, where the achievements that held a civilization together have been filed under tyranny in the ledgers of later men. To restore the truth, one must descend into the mountain as one descends into any cold case, with patience, with rigor, with the willingness to walk past the inherited verdict and look again at what the evidence actually says. In 1974, this descent began in the most unexpected place, a farmer's well-digging pit. Why did the inherited narrative of Qin Shi Huang become poisonous in the first place? The answer is layered, politically complex, and stretches back more than 2 millennia. The first stream of distortion flowed from Confucian historiography, which dominated the Han Dynasty shortly after Qin's collapse. Confucian scholars, who had been politically marginalized and persecuted under Qin's legalist regime, had every motivation to portray the first emperor in the darkest possible light. They inherited the writing of history. They played the long game, and they played it across centuries. The second stream flowed from Western interpretations of the 19th and 20th centuries, where Chinese civilization was routinely portrayed as stagnant, autocratic, and incapable of generating sophisticated engineering on its own. The first emperor, in Western hands, became a kind of exotic despot, a curiosity rather than a founder of a unified civilization. Buried victim of these two streams of inherited narrative contained one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history. Ying Zheng, son of the king of Qin, ascended to the throne of his small, western mountain kingdom in 247 BCE at the age of 9. By the time he was 38, every rival state had fallen, and Ying Zheng held dominion over a unified China for the first time in human history. He commissioned the first Great Wall. He unified the written script. He standardized weights, measures, and currency across thousands of miles. He built the first national road system. He created the first national postal service. He codified the legalist philosophy into a working governing doctrine that pacified bandits, protected farmers, and administered justice through a uniform system for over 1 billion acres of land. The achievement is staggering in its sheer scope. No other ancient ruler in world history accomplished anything comparable to this breadth of imperial consolidation in a single lifetime. Yet the inherited narrative of Qin Shi Huang, repeated by later dynasties, repeated by some modern historians, repeated in schoolbook summaries with lazy regularity, is one of tyranny, paranoia, and megalomania. A man who burned books, a man who buried scholars alive, a man who built a tomb for an army that did not exist. The inherited narrative cast him as a villain, a cautionary tale, a tyrant whose excesses justified the rebellions that consumed his empire within 3 years of his death. Every clay face emerging from that 1974 pit was a courtroom witness, rising one by one to contradict the inherited verdict. By October 1975, the small investigative team had become a national undertaking. Hundreds of workers were deployed to Lintang. Scaffolding rose above what would become Pit 1, the largest excavation chamber, measuring approximately 230 meters long by 62 meters wide. The senior archaeological team, working through the cold Shanxi winters and the blistering summers, did not yet know that they were uncovering the most significant archaeological find of the 20th century. The provincial archaeologist Zhao Kangmin, who played a defining role in the early recovery effort, later described the experience as being handed a piece of the sky. What emerged from those years of excavation was not a single statue. It was an army. The rows stretched in disciplined formation, warriors on foot, archers with crossbows drawn, cavalry with horse and rider preserved as paired sculpture, charioteers with hands raised to hold vanished reins, generals elevated on platforms above their troops. Each warrior had been sculpted individually. Each carried a uniquely chiseled face. Each wore armor whose plates were rendered in clay with the precision of a master jeweler. Some wore the helmets of foot soldiers. Some wore the distinctive caps of cuirassiers. Some bore the long side curls of higher-ranking officers. There were archers with low ponytails and infantrymen with squared shoulders. There were figures that scholars would later identify as belonging to specific ethnic minorities of the unified empire, figures with features matching Costa. Peoples, figures with features matching northern nomads, figures with features matching the described appearance of conquered Korean peninsula tribes. This was not an army for display. The positioning, the spacing, the directional orientation, these were the markers of a real battle formation. The figures faced east, toward the territories the Qin state had conquered during the Warring States period, as though guarding the tomb against the ghosts of defeated rivals. A terracotta rabbit was later discovered in one pit, a terracotta duck, a terracotta waterfowl, a half-naked acrobat figure in the kneeling position of a man urinating. The army was a complete world, a microcosm of the empire, baked in clay and lowered into the earth as a permanent honor guard for the first emperor's passage into the next life. The discovery did not merely add a chapter to Chinese history. It detonated the chapter that had been written. The ripple effect began in scholarly journals and reached every continent within months. The British Museum dispatched specialists. The Smithsonian sent representatives. Japanese archaeologists, many of whom had spent decades studying their own terracotta tomb traditions, traveled in delegations. French historians of classical antiquity began drawing comparative analysis between the Qin warriors and the painted figures of Etruscan tombs in Italy. The New York Times ran a feature that occupied an entire page of the Sunday edition. The discovery became a Cold War pivot point, proof, in the form of clay soldiers, that an ancient civilization far older than many Western traditions had mastered the technology of large-scale figurative sculpture, of metallurgy, of mass production, of administrative planning on a scale that no contemporary civilization in the West had attempted. For Zhao Kangmin and his team, however, this international attention came with a heavy cost. Pressure mounted from Beijing to accelerate the excavation. Pressure mounted from international archaeologists to share preliminary findings. Pressure mounted from the popular press to present figures that the team knew were unstable and required careful conservation. Many of the figures, when first uncovered, had held the brilliant traces of original paint, mineral-based pigments that had survived 2,000 years underground only to oxidize within minutes of contact with the dry outside air. The brilliant reds, the deep blues, the vibrant yellows evaporated in front of cameras, and cameras captured the loss. Critics, decades later, would accuse the early teams of poor conservation. The truth was more complex. The technology did not yet exist to stabilize such pigments under field conditions. The team improvised. The team learned. Each pit, each figure, each fragment taught them more about a process no one in the modern world had ever performed. If you believe the silenced architects of ancient civilizations deserve their voices restored, please subscribe and join our investigators. While the modern archaeologists worked through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the construction team of 246 BCE worked in flashback across the minds of every scholar who held a chiseled soldier in their hands. The heat of the kilns, the dust of the workshops, the weight of labor on thousands of workers, the mountains of clay hauled on wooden carts across roads built specifically for this project. The kilns, stacked with copper-rich green-glazed roof tiles for above-ground structures, fired at temperatures no Western kiln of the period matched. The foremen shouting in regional dialects. The scholars calculating on bamboo strips bound with hemp cord the precise positional arrangements of every figure in the formation. The artists, often prisoners of war from conquered states, often craftsmen recruited from across the new empire, squatting in the dust, carving each face one by one. Each face a different face. Each face a memory of a real human being who had worn the armor of the first emperor. Each sculptor working from a living model, the real soldiers of the unified empire, so that when the army was lowered into the earth, it carried the literal faces of the men who had made the unification possible. The slow-motion reveal, in other words, was not merely about clay. It was about a civilization so vast, so rich, so administratively complex that it could produce, in a single multi-year project, a formation of more than 7,000 lifelike soldiers to guard the passage of a single man into the afterlife. The army was only one piece of the necropolis. Outside the main tomb mounds themselves, archaeologists later discovered bronze chariots, 4 of them in a separate pit complex, complete with charioteer figures and horses. The chariots were found in fragments, the wooden components long since rotted away, but the bronze fittings survived with stunning detail. Bridles, harnesses, even the tiny screw threads that had held the original. Wheels in place. The metal's science alone was a generation ahead of European innovation of the same period. The site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Location in 1987. International collaboration agreements were signed with British, German, Japanese, and American institutions. The Pit 2 excavation, which revealed the most sophisticated cavalry and infantry figures in the entire complex, was conducted with the aid of German conservation specialists using the most advanced preservation chemistry of the day. Volunteers and graduate students from across the world arrived to participate, to learn, to add their small hands to the larger work. The supporting infrastructure, the vast museum complex now surrounding the on-site excavation halls, the visitor centers, the research libraries, the underground conservation laboratories, transformed a quiet patch of rural China into one of the most visited archaeological destinations on the planet. And this is where the title of our investigation finds its modern echo. Because buried within this larger story lies a smaller one, the story of a young conservator who walked to the gates of Pit 1 in 1983 and was told, very simply, that she could not enter. She was 26 years old. She had been trained at the Academy of Arts and Design in Beijing, and she had completed her doctoral fieldwork at the conservation laboratories in Munich on a scholarship that the German Archaeological Institute had extended to her as part of the joint collaboration with the Shanxi Provincial Museum. Her name, the one the historical record preserves, was Wen Jai. Her expertise was the chemical stabilization of mineral pigments on fired ceramic substrates. She was, in plain terms, a nurse for dyeing paint. The paint on the warriors was dying faster than anyone in Beijing had anticipated. The oxidation that began the moment the figures were exposed to outside air was not a seasonal problem. It was an existential threat. The figures that survived the excavation with visible pigment would lose that pigment within days if not stabilized immediately. Wen Jai had spent 4 years developing a stabilization compound, a colorless polymer that bonded to fired ceramic surfaces without altering their optical properties. The compound had never been field tested. It had only been tested on laboratory replicas. Without field testing, she could not prove it would work on the real figures. She arrived at Lintang in the late autumn when the wheat was short and the persimmon trees along the village roads had just begun to shed their fruit. Her credentials were impeccable. Her institutional backing was unimpeachable. And yet when she presented herself at the gate of the main excavation enclosure, the soldiers stationed there refused her entry. She was a young woman. The soldiers at the gate were not military men of the elite. They were local militia, older weathered, dressed in plain uniforms that had seen years of wear. They were suspicious of her. They could not read the German language documents alongside the Chinese language authorization letters. They did not understand why a slender young woman with cropped hair and laboratory glasses was being dispatched to a site populated by senior archaeologists and PLA engineering corps officers. Their instructions were simple. They were to keep unauthorized personnel away from the pits. They could not, in their judgment, place a young woman in that category without higher verification. They held the line. When Jai stood at the gate for the better part of an hour, her identification documents in her hands, her credentials stamped and signed by senior officials who had been told explicitly to expedite her arrival. She did not raise her voice. She did not push. She did not attempt to argue with the men whose duty was to protect the site. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in Beijing had prepared her to understand, that the gatekeepers were not being cruel. They were being careful. They had been warned about foreign journalists trying to enter the pits. They had been warned about souvenir hunters. They had been warned about looters and about opportunists who wanted photographs for personal gain or political leverage. A young woman whose papers did not match the pattern of any visitor they had been briefed about triggered caution. The soldiers had done their duty. They had done exactly what their officers had told them to do. Wen Jai, in her quiet way, understood this. The humiliation, if it can be called humiliation, was a product of bureaucratic friction, not malice. And then, from the interior courtyard of the excavation complex, a vehicle pulled up. A black sedan, late model, with the official flag of the People's Liberation Army affixed to its front bumper. The vehicle stopped. A senior officer stepped out. He wore the uniform of a PLA Major General, his insignia plain but unmistakable, his rank pins visible even across the courtyards. He had been dispatched, on the recommendation of the State Administration of Cultural Heritage, to inspect the conservation protocols underway at Pit 1. He was, by training and by background, an engineer, a man who had supervised dam construction in Sichuan province before being reassigned in the early 1980s to oversee the protection of major archaeological sites across Shanxi and Gansu. He knew the battlefield of Lintang not by the names of figures, but by the engineering specifications of the supporting structures. He did not know Wen Jai. He had not heard her name before this morning, but the gate soldiers recognized him instantly, snapped to attention, and saluted. He returned the salute, then turned his attention to the young woman standing outside the fence with her documents clutched in both hands. The senior officer, Major General Bai Fengshen, for the historical record, studied her credentials. He studied the German stamp on her collaboration letter. He studied the signature of the Academy of Arts and Design president. He studied, finally, the photograph and the name. Then he nodded once and turned to the gate guard. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He used the precise tone of a senior officer addressing a subordinate who had carried out instructions faithfully and now needed to be updated on a nuance the original briefing had not covered. "Let her in," he said. "Address her as ma'am. She is the senior conservator assigned to this site." The words landed on Wenjai like a credential of citizenship. She had spent 4 years in German laboratories, where her Chinese accent had been pointed out by colleagues. She had spent 3 years writing doctoral defense papers in a second language. She had entered her discipline at a time when the senior ranks of Chinese archaeology and conservation were still overwhelmingly populated by men who had risen through institutional hierarchies built during the early decades of the People's Republic. She was not the first woman in her field, but she was the youngest and often the only one in the room. To have a senior PLA general address her in front of subordinate soldiers with the honorific reserved for respected officers, not because she was an officer, but because she was the senior technical expert assigned to the site, was an act of recognition so small and so consequential that the historical record deserves to preserve it. She stepped through the gate. The soldiers saluted. She returned the salute with the stiffness of someone who had never been saluted before. Then she walked toward Pit 1, where the first waiting figure, a kneeling archer with arms extended as though still drawing a crossbow, was already beginning to lose chromatic definition. In the days that followed, she worked with a discipline that bordered on ritual. She mixed her polymer compound in small glass beakers, brushed it onto test patches of painted ceramic that had been detached from the larger figures for clinical observation, recorded the refractive indices in a leather-bound notebook, took photographs with a camera she had brought back from Munich, and walked the perimeter of the pit daily to assess the rate of pigment loss on the figures she had not yet treated. The senior PLA officer returned twice over the following weeks to inspect progress. Each time the gate guards let her through without question. Each time she was addressed as Comrade Wen by the Major General himself, who had by then received a more complete briefing on her training and a final report from the State Administration of Cultural Heritage confirming her designation. She was, by all administrative metrics, the senior conservator on site. The title had not changed. The respect had. If you believe that history's quietest heroes, the nameless ones whose warrants were questioned at gates they had every right to walk through, deserve to be remembered, please subscribe and join our investigators. The paint preservation work she pioneered at Lintong would become a methodology later applied to similar finds across the world. When archaeologists later recovered polychrome sculpture from Greco-Roman tombs, from Khmer temple deposits, from Mesoamerican underground caches, they reached for techniques Wenjai had tested in real time on the warriors of the first emperor. Her name did not become famous. Her name did not become a household word. Her name did not even appear prominently in the major English-language publications that summarized Lintong's history, but her methodology became foundational. This is the shape of historical justice that the cold case demands, not always the restoration of a single famous figure, but the restoration of an entire supporting army of unseen hands. The clay faces that emerged from Lintong in 1974 had already begun the long restoration of Qin Shi Huang himself. The faces were not the faces of barbarians. They were the faces of engineers, of administrators, of soldiers who served the most sophisticated state apparatus the ancient world had produced. Each chiseled beard, each rendered scar, each painted cheek, each meticulously tied hair knot was evidence that the inherited verdict of tyranny had been from the beginning a story told by the victors of a subsequent dynasty who had political reasons to diminish the accomplishments of their predecessors. The Chinese nation has, over the past 4 decades, done something extraordinary in response to this physical evidence. It has refused to let the inherited verdict stand unchallenged. State-funded research institutes have dedicated entire programs to the reassessment of the first emperor's reign. Major monographs have been published arguing that the book burning incident Sima Qian described was not a wholesale destruction of knowledge, but a specific purge of philosophical texts deemed politically destabilizing at the moment of unification. A far more nuanced event than later dynasties were willing to record. Major museums across China have reoriented their interpretation of Qin Shi Huang from villain to founder, from tyrant to consolidator. Textbooks in slow shifts over the past 3 decades have been rewritten. Schoolchildren in Shanxi are growing up learning that the man beneath Mount Li was the architect of the state that made them possible. The pivot has not been complete. The inherited narrative still carries weight, but the pivot has been real, and it has been earned by the clay faces that emerged from a farmer's well in the spring of 1974. Major archaeological events in recent decades have only deepened this restoration. The tomb mound of Qin Shi Huang itself has never been excavated. Modern Chinese archaeologists, supported by international scientific advisory panels, have used ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and high-resolution gravimetric surveys to map the suspected contents of the unexcavated chamber. The results, published in technical journals in the 2010s and 2020s, suggest that the inner structure is even more elaborate than Sima Qian described. There appear to be multiple nested chambers, separated by earthen barriers, with internal passages that run for hundreds of meters. Mercury anomalies in the soil readings, distributed in patterns consistent with the historical descriptions of mechanical rivers of flowing quicksilver, suggest the original accounts were not literary flourish but factual observation. The potential remains for a future excavation of unprecedented scale and significance, one that will, when it occurs, illuminate the inner life of the first emperor in ways no modern historian could have anticipated. Until then, the army stands guard. The general in Pit 3 faces west, toward the Passage of Death, and his command staff of 70 warriors enforces his silent order. The kneeling archers in the eastern ranks hold their positions. The cavalry preserves its forward momentum. The single figure of an acrobatic soldier in the corner of one pit, captured in a moment of bodily relief, reminds the visitor that even emperors must be served by whole men, not merely idealized men. Wen Jai, in her quiet preservation work, understood this most fully. Her task was not to recreate the warriors. Her task was to keep them alive in the only way that mattered, keeping the pigment of their original faces from disappearing into dust, keeping the chromatic evidence of their humanity present for the eyes of future visitors. Each polymer brushstroke was a refusal. Each test patch was an act of resistance against the inherited verdict that the work of the first emperor deserved only erasure. She retired from the State Administration of Cultural Heritage in 2014. The Terracotta Army Conservation Program continues under the methodologies she developed. The Major General who addressed her as Ma'am rose over the subsequent years to the rank of Lieutenant General, then Senior Lieutenant General, before retiring in the early 1990s. He never wrote a memoir, and his name appears in only one footnote of the published history of the Lintang site, a footnote that credits his office for facilitating international collaboration. The footnote does not mention Wen Jai. The footnote does not mention the gate guards. The footnote does not mention the hour she waited at the fence in the late autumn cold, with documents clutched in both hands, refused entry to a site she had every institutional right to enter. But the army remembers, the paint remembers, the clay remembers, the mountain remembers. The first emperor, if the historical cold case can ever be truly closed, would have been satisfied with this. He built an army to last 22 centuries. The army has done so. The pigments that survived the burial are surviving still, thanks to a young woman who waited at a gate and a senior officer who called her ma'am. The story of Qin Shi Huang is not a single cent. Ori, it is a constellation of overlapping tales, told across generations, told across dynasties, told across the patient labor of gardeners, well-diggers, scholars, painters, soldiers, gate guards, and conservators. Each one of them holds a piece of the truth. Each one of them has earned the right to stand in the still air of the excavation hall, looking at the faces of men who lived 2,000 years before them, and to know, with the certainty of evidence, not legend, that the inherited stories were wrong. The mountain still holds its secrets. The inner chamber has not been entered. The rivers of mercury, if they exist in the patterns the soil readings suggest, still flow in their sealed channels. The pearl-starred ceiling, if it survives, has not yet been seen by modern eyes. But the truth has stood up from the earth. It has been recognized. It has been protected. It has been, against all the inherited narratives that tried to bury it, restored. If you believe that history's silenced architects deserve investigators as relentless as the soldiers of clay who guarded their emperor, please subscribe and join our community of restoration.